Hi everyone! In this week's presentation, we will be discussing the topic of gambling. We'll cover what gambling is, this week's reading, and the link between gambling and interpersonal relationships. And a fun class activity at the end. Now, let's start off by asking the question, what exactly is gambling? Most of you probably already know, but it's always good to give a refresher. So, gambling is described as placing something of value at risk in the hopes of gaining something of greater value. Gambling may take the form of betting on horses, wagering in casinos, participating in the lottery, card games, and sporting events. Gambling can also be woven into your life in subtle ways, especially with children. I'm looking at you, Chuck E. Cheese. This reading was an article that investigated the personality characteristics of over 800 adolescents of varying gambling involvement. Now, this wasn't an experiment. It was simply exploratory in nature. They administered self-report questionnaires, such as the DSM-4J, which is a screen for adolescent pathological gambling adapted from the DSM-4's adult criteria for pathological gambling, the High School Personality Questionnaire, Sensation Seeking Scale Form 4, and Gambling Activities Questionnaire. The sample was classified into 4 categories. There were non-gamblers who never gambled within the previous 12 months, social gamblers who did gamble in the previous 12 months, but little to no gambling-related problems according to the DSM-4J, at-risk gamblers who received a score of 2 or 3 on the DSM-4J, and pathological gamblers that had a score of 4 or more from the DSM-4J. So now on to the results. The results showed that on the HSPQ, significant differences were found in the different groups on 9 of the personality factors: emotional stability, excitability, cheerfulness, conformity, sensitivity, self-discipline, and tension. Pathological gamblers scored lowest on self-discipline, conformity, emotional stability, sensitivity, and highest on excitability, cheerfulness, and tension in comparison to the other 3 groups. In regard to the sensation-seeking scores, pathological gamblers had the highest overall score, scoring the highest in all of the following subcategories of boredom, disinhibition, excitement-seeking, and thrill and adventure. However, the older the age group, the lower the sensation-seeking scores are. So it's not seen as a strong link to gambling, as it can vary with age. It is noted that an important finding of the study is that there are personality traits other than impulsivity that are strongly associated to gambling problems. The knowledge that this study provides about personality can assist in guiding and helping youth who are at an increased risk of engaging in gambling. Although, it does emphasize that there are many variables at play, and that these people with these certain personality characteristics don't always participate in gambling, and actually may never participate in gambling. It is interesting to see the links made between certain characteristics and personalities and gambling. Although more research needs to be done, it's a good stepping stone into helping at-risk youth and understanding those susceptible to such addictions. How these findings relate to interpersonal relationships is another discussion that we will talk about right now.
A gambling addiction is something that not only affects the person who chooses to gamble, but the people who are close to them as well. It affects everyone around them, especially family. Lying to one's family, stealing money, and other manipulation tactics are commonly used to fuel gambling addictions. Due to this, the family structure of a gambler becomes unstable, and the family becomes wearier and more untrustworthy of the gambler. Kalashik's studies concluded that most problem gamblers spent an average of $500 to $2,000 per month on gambling-related activities. Due to this excessive amount of money being spent, many families reported that they often felt stressed due to financial needs and requirements not being met. This stress was not only felt by the adults in the family, but also by children in these households, as they would often face the consequences of the financial stress. One of the interviewees in the study recounted how her son had proceeded to steal all the money that was gained from selling a house, and how this had ruined everything that was planned out for their future, as all the money was now gone. Kalishuk goes on to say that problem gambling was common due to trauma and used as a way of coping for the gambler. However, while this has helped the gambler, it caused tension and turmoil within familial relationships. Many family members in this study described feeling lost and frustrated. This often created a threat to family relationships, as trust within the family was constantly breached, causing emotional and personal turmoil. Kalishuk emphasized in the study that family members of someone with a gambling addiction often experienced peaks and valleys, and that it was similar to constantly riding an emotional roller coaster. One member of this study had turned to excessively drinking as a way to cope with financial losses and emotional turmoil caused by the addiction. Also to other children in the family, as they also experienced higher levels of stress and worry, as well as feelings of guilt due to thinking that the situation might be their fault, or that they are the reason turmoil within the family is rising. In conclusion, this study by Kalishuk further reinforced the idea that gambling addictions not only cause strain on the gambler, but on those who are close to them, such as family and familial relationships. It also further enforced the idea that the loss, tension, and emotional strain that can be felt due to a gambling addiction is not only limited to the gambler, but is instead felt by those who are closest to them as well.
Gambling addictions affect romantic relationships. Gambling as a behavioral disorder, referred to as compulsive or pathological gambling, is not commonly discussed and lacks the amount of support and services that are usually provided for other addictive disorders in the field of psychology. According to my research, there has been a recent development of community-based treatment services for individuals dealing with compulsive gambling, but there remains to be a great lack of support for those affected by the gambler. There is very little information on the psychological factors contributing to this disorder. The research collected investigated the impact of compulsive gambling on the spouse of the gambler. In direct reaction to the gambler's activities, a spouse of such gambler is affected by significant social, economic, and psychological stresses. In my chosen study, these stresses are observed through descriptive characteristics and dysfunctional coping responses demonstrated by the spouses. In a questionnaire-formatted study, researchers assessed a large group of spouses on a wide range of topics. Some of these topics included the nature of the participants' relationship, personal characteristics about themselves and the gamblers, awareness of the issue, and impacts and major problems affecting them due to the gambling activities. In regards to the demographics of the study, it is important to note that a very large percentage, about 98%, of the spouses were women, although aside from gender, there were no other major demographical differences. A very slim portion of spouses reported to be aware of their partner's gambling addiction at the time of marriage. About 3/4 of them acknowledged the problem within a couple of years, with the remaining 25% acknowledging it only 9+ years later. Majority of cases demonstrated that the spouses of the gambler recognizes the issue before the gamblers do themselves. A very large percentage of respondents, 85%, share that their experiences in a relationship with a compulsive gambler made them emotionally ill. About half of them share that they participated in dysfunctional patterns of behavior in an attempt to cope. Some of these patterns discussed were excessive drinking, smoking, and irregular eating. Additionally, many cases of verbal and physical abuse were recorded, as well as an apparent loss of interest in sex by the gambler. About 12% of these respondents also recorded attempts of suicide, which commonly occurred following failed threats of separation or divorce. Additionally, a major problem in romantic relationships impacted by the gambler's activities are financial difficulties. Majority of spouses get stuck providing bailouts and very frequently dip into their savings to assist their partner's losses. Many also report to have reached out to family and friends for financial support, which, to no surprise, takes a major toll on the spouse's social relationships as well. Financial assistance, such as loans, are also very common in times of financial need due to a partner's gambling activities. Although spouses commonly attempt to enforce limited access to shared finances in cases like these, it is quite difficult to uphold such a policy, as their addicted partners demonstrate very persistent and manipulative behaviors. Amongst the many observable characteristics of a gambler, the results of this study demonstrated a very high commonality of the following: lying, dishonesty, irresponsibility, poor communication, insincerity, and impulsiveness. In addition, all respondents shared that there is an observable lack of control over actions and a state of being emotionally ill in their gambling partners. As collected from my research, it is clear that there is a very poor impact on the spouses of a gambler, and it is quite difficult to provide spousal assistance in this developing area of addiction, especially when there is such a limitation of support services for the spouses themselves. As a primary observer, it is important that these individuals get the opportunity to discuss and assess the problem, both for themselves and their troubled partner.
Gambling in friendships and peer relationships. Gambling addictions are a very serious problem, and for adolescents experiencing gambling addiction, this problem is exacerbated by the importance of friendships and a social relatedness, particularly at this stage in life. Social identity and relationships are recognized as a key determinant of overall well-being and behavior. This relates to their connectedness in a desired social group or their in-groups, which according to research enhances self-esteem and contributes to many decision-making processes. Once social identity with the desired group is established, adolescents are more motivated to behave within the group norms. With groups that are abstaining from online risky behavior, this proves to be a healthy and supportive environment. Ultimately, social connectedness does not necessarily prove to act as a protective factor against gambling addictions. It is the social factors that facilitate these specific behaviors. Online social relationships allow adolescents to find other like-minded people who are not necessarily living by healthy supportive norms. A large community of online peers are consistently bombarded with harmful and risky content are detrimental to youth who participate, especially for those who feel lower levels of connection with their offline peers and are looking for a sense of self, willing to engage in any behaviors in order to make that happen. Over the last decade, new gambling technologies have made different forms of gambling widespread and easier for younger individuals. Internet gambling has offered adolescents the ability to partake in gambling even under the legal age, and a surprising amount do. Gambling can offer many subjective benefits such as excitement, entertainment, and a perceived sense of acquiring wealth without much effort. And adolescents who are already influential, sensation, and risk-seeking individuals are particularly vulnerable to partake in these activities very easily, especially with the help of shared social circles engaging in the same things. On the other hand, perceived social support received from meaningful groups has been linked with lower levels of internet addiction amongst adolescents. This does not mean peer identification and only a sense of belongingness. It dictates positive influences from friends and family engaging in non-problematic behavior that moderate the decision-making processes of gambling addictions, as well as the social learning and facilitation that occurs. Offline relationships were included in these social supports. Online relationships did not have the same effect. The YMCA dictates serious consequences that gambling involves to those suffering and their close friends and family. Consequences can manifest in social neglection of relationships, as well as economic issues with borrowing or stealing money from peers. Consequences can also include depression and anxiety, as well as anger and violence when prevented from playing. Escape can be a motivator to engage in internet use and create an online presence, and there are also egotistical features that are important in youth social dynamics. This includes status and power, which could increase with consecutive wins, and can promote gambling addictions to continue if they receive these constant highs. Egotistical features are particularly associated with informal gambling within peer groups, yet can also occur online. When thinking about adolescent gambling addictions, it is important to remember that there are preventative social factors, such as peer support, that in combination with a high self-esteem aid in promoting healthy behaviors that preoccupy these individuals, leading them away from addictive gambling. However, social identification issues and a sense of belongingness can suggest that gambling individuals are socially motivated to participate and assimilate with the desired peer group via the behavior of addictive gambling, and the cycle can begin to strengthen.
Working is something that we will all be subjected to in our lifetime, in some form or another. For many of us, we are already balancing jobs with a laundry list of other responsibilities. This same group that I am talking about also probably knows about how important the relationships that we form at work are. Whether they be the relationships that we keep strictly for the professional aspects of our jobs, or the deeper relationships in which we are actually able to connect to our coworkers. It is evident that our relationships can make or break our experience at a certain position. Workplace relations have a complex connection to gambling and gamblers. These relationships can both influence gambling and be impacted by gambling. Take, for example, an individual who works in an office full of sports bettors. Every day at lunch, they hear about the various aspects of sports betting and the big wins of their coworkers. It would logically follow that the longer this individual is present in this office, the more likely they will be to adapt to this behavior and join in on the betting. This is called exposure theory, and it has strong ties to other aspects of gambling as well. Let's set another scene. Imagine that there is an individual who feels like they have poor control over the work that they do. They get little value from their work relations and actually performing at their job. A concept called alienation theory states that this individual is both more likely to and more intensely to participate in skilled-based forms of gambling. This is said to compensate for the lack of ability that they display in their job. Demographic factors in the workplace can also have a correlation with gambling rates. If a workplace is strongly composed of the demographic groups that often gamble, then it is more likely to follow that others in the workplace will gamble as well. Demographics of gamblers change with location, but let's say, for example, the strongest demographic of gamblers in a population is within males from the ages of 25 to 35. A workplace which strongly represents this male demographic will have higher rates of gambling, even in individuals who fall outside of this demographic. This aspect of gambling clearly relates to exposure theory, which was mentioned previously. Gambling can also affect workplace relations in many of the same manners that affects other forms of relationships. We are going to spend a lot of time in our workplaces throughout our lives. It's a no-brainer. Gambling is a factor that is shown to diffuse far and wide in a workplace population. With the substantial impacts that gambling can have on the individual's life, it is important to stay cognizant of these influential factors that will surround us.
Now it's time for the class activity. We're going to ask you a couple of discussion questions and show you a video. The first discussion question asks, to what extent do you believe that the act of gambling is acceptable? Should any form of gambling even be acceptable at all? The second question asks, based on the information given throughout our video, which relationships do you believe to be the most affected by gambling, and why do you think this? The third question asks, gambling addiction is often related to substance abuse. What do you believe are the key differences between the ways that these two problematic behaviors affect relationships?
You know what? I didn't tell my wife when she came home. There was something not quite right about it. I began to be engaged. I began to watch sport a bit more. I began to read the papers, try and understand it. And at first I stuck to the things I knew, just small bets. I even worked from home and told my boss I'd just come into the office one day a week, and then boredom hit me because I'd finish my work in the morning and the rest of the day would stretch out. I began to withdraw as a husband as I gambled more. I began to withdraw as a dad. And then one day I worked out I was losing more often than I was winning. That made me cross because I'm a bad loser, but I'm competitive. I'm also very optimistic. I'm expecting to win. So I took £1,000. £1,000, I'd never bet anything like that much money before. And I placed it on the outcome of a tennis match, thinking if I won, I'd win all my money back that I'd lost and then it would be okay. I lost that bet. The first thing I did is phone my bank. I got an overdraft for another £1,000. I lost those two bets, and now there was a hole in our finances. Emma trusted me completely with our money. But rather than talk about it, tell her, or change our habits slightly, just tighten our belts on the budget, I carried on living like we always lived, spending. I didn't want people to know about my habit. I didn't want a difficult conversation. I felt ashamed. I felt guilty about what I was doing. And now, to catch up this hole, I began to bet more and more frequently. I began to spend more time. I began to spend more money. Emma thought it was her. She thought it was my job, or the fact we lived in a town, and she knew how much I loved the countryside. So when someone offered us a good price for a house, we took it. I put the equity of the sale of our house, £170,000, into my own account. 6 weeks later, we were in a rented property where I lived. I was in the office I used, and I could see Emma coming up the lane. She had a spring in her step. She was very happy about something. She got to the window and called up. She said, "Justin, I found it. I found the perfect house. Come on, come with me." And we saw a beautiful house that just come onto the market. That would have been perfect. A place where Emma thought she could have got me back. A place where her children would be safe, because by now little Oscar had been born as well. And then I remembered. And I desperately looked for a way out. There was a little pond in the corner. And I said to Emma, "We can't live here. Matthew might fall in and drown." That lovely smile on her face. You see, I'd squandered the equity from our property. There's no way I could afford the deposit. In fact, there's no way I would have been given a mortgage, because by now, to cover up the gap, I desperately tried to borrow. You see, I thought that I got myself into this mess. I'm the one that needs to get myself out of it. And I thought that I'd just keep gambling, and that'll be the way through it. My own stupid pride stopped me from getting any help. And because I kept it a secret, and the problem with gambling addiction is you can keep it a secret. There's no visible signs. Apart from my mood swings, things just got worse. It came to a head when one day I lost my job because I'd used my corporate card on my gambling account. I should have gone home and told Emma everything, but I didn't. I told her I'd left that job and gone to another one. You know, the lies that I told my wife were one of the most hurtful things, because that trust we had was so fragile. It was so precious. And she found out because we had friends to stay, and they showed her a bank statement and said, "Do you know what your husband's doing?" Even my lovely son Matthew, one day he just wanted me to take him to the swings. He said, "Dad, please take me to the swings." And the day that he walked, by the way, was the happiest day of our lives. And now he just wanted to spend some time with his dad. We were down at my in-laws' house. It was raining. So Emma said to me, "Okay, take him, but go home first and pick up his coat." So I drove back home and I put my hand on his coat. Matthew was asleep in the front seat, strapped in. And I remembered that night I'd put a bet on. I thought I'd just go and check. And I went upstairs and I'd lost that bet. So I went to the most horrible place you end up when you're a gambling addict. I went to the online casino. I thought I'll just have one quick spin, win that money back that I should have had in my account, and then I can go and have a good time with my son. 2.5 hours later, I'd emptied out my bank account again. I went downstairs and Matthew had cried himself to sleep, and the tears that he'd cried were dried on his cheeks. What kind of a dad does that? Only one who by now is in real problems.
Now that you've watched the video, let's look at its discussion questions. The first one's asking, which of this individual's relationships were directly affected by their gamblings? The second question asks, using the information from our presentation, what repercussions do you believe this individual's actions had on his relationship with his wife, children, family, and friends? Thank you for watching this week's video on gambling. We hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed making it. We hope you learned something helpful.